Hi everyone, and greetings, and welcome to Security Magazine's Geo-Cyber video podcast with myself, Ian Thornton-Trump, and lovely co-host, Philip Ingram. Welcome, Philip.
I don't think I've ever been called lovely. Mind you, we're sitting in a lovely pub, the friend in hand, and it's a fantastic place to sit and do this.
We really enjoy it, and I want to sort of talk about, I think the first thing we need to do, of course, is catch up on what's going on in Russia-Ukraine.
Yeah, Russia-Ukraine, interesting at the moment. I think the Russians have done, in military terms, what we call the culminated, or the close to culminating. We've had this talk about a Russian spring offensive coming in. A spring is starting to come in, the ground has turned into a quagmire. It's unfrozen, it's not good for military vehicles to maneuver on, whether they be tracked vehicles or wheeled vehicles. The mud sucks and it sticks. And the Russians found this out last year. And at the moment, they haven't been able to get that or generate that combat power to punch through the Ukrainian defences and exploit further out into the Donbass region that they're trying to capture all of. The whole focus has been around Bakhmut.
Right. The former pile of rubble.
Former pile of rubble. It's an increasing pile of rubble. I think it's turning into dust. There's that much artillery being fired into it. But Bakhmut's interesting. It's a small, relatively insignificant little town on a 1,200 kilometre front line. But we all seem to be focused on it. And the Russians have been trying to capture it now for over 8 months. And it's the Wagner private military company that has been doing that. And therefore this is a fantastic information operation by the Wagner private military company, suggesting to not just the world but to the Russian domestic audience that it's them that are fighting all of the battles, because it's all Bakhmut. They're not having much success.
No.
So the Ukrainians are fixing them in place. And it's useful that they're fixing them in place and everyone's focused on there, because the Russians are focused on trying to reinforce what isn't working. So almost reinforced defeat, because they want to get some form of victory in it, but they're focusing everything on that psychologically as well, and that means what they're not doing is they're not watching what the Ukrainians could be preparing elsewhere,
especially in the rear areas, and
as they prepare their formations for a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive or reoffensive as the ground hardens up and they get Western equipment and spring turns into early summer. And that's the sort of time when I think things could be happening then. The Russian regular army are doing a little bit more further south. They're trying to gain some successes, but they're losing some of their better formations that they have left. And there's still this real friction between Prigozhin, the financier behind the Wagner group, and Gerasimov, who is the overall Russian commander, but is coming at things from a regular military perspective. They don't see eye to eye, and we haven't got unity of command. That never bodes well. And I think the Ukrainians are sitting back and just carefully watching.
Yeah, and trying to inflict as much.
They're inflicting as much as possible. They're suffering huge casualties as well. But I think they're calculating that that's going to be worth it as they get the new equipment in, where their people are not just trained to operate it, but to fight it and get ready for their own counteroffensives. And we could see the fracturing of the Russian defences at some stage later on this year.
It's interesting to me too, because I know there was a big report about 2 submarines and 2 guided missile cruisers, apparently all loaded with the latest and greatest technology. But it seems like they continue to lob missiles at civilian targets and targets of not any sort of military value, rather than reinforcing and supporting with attacks in depth in that area where the Ukraine is defending. Yeah. So it rather seems that there is two sort of, I think that's a great observation, because there seems to be two tactical approaches to a strategic problem, and like you said, that doesn't work out particularly well.
Well, and again, this is where I think we're getting long-handled screwdriver strategic meddling from Moscow. The use of the missiles attacking Ukrainian critical national infrastructure and civilian targets is trying to fracture the will of the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
It's actually increasing the resolve of the Ukrainian
That's
people.
what I was thinking to say, yeah, absolutely.
And the missiles and things that they're using, they'll not affect the tactical battle hugely unless the Russians can target Ukrainian command and control centres and logistics centres. And it seems as if they're not doing that, because the Ukrainians are shooting a lot of the missiles down. So I suspect that their command and control centres and their logistic bases are very well protected from an air defence perspective. And again, the Russians are running out of missiles.
And drones, apparently.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of UK Defence Intelligence reports where they're only been able to fire what's been manufactured that month. And the supply of the Shahad 136 kamikaze drones from Iran is not coming through in the sort of the numbers and the speed that Russia was hoping for. So that's why we're seeing a big salvo for a day, and then nothing for 2 or 3 weeks, and then another salvo. It's only what's been manufactured and they can get out there. That doesn't bode well for the Russians.
No, it doesn't. And, speaking of salvos, which is a great segue, Brussels put out the call a couple of days ago for 1 million rounds of artillery for Ukraine. Nothing says you're getting ready for a battle more than, asking for a whole bunch of artillery. And interestingly enough, in Poland at the sort of American forward staging base for the supplies, fuel trucks.
Yes.
In abundance.
Yeah.
So it's clear to me that the Ukraine, especially when you said when the weather gets a bit better, is going to need 2 things. Fuel for tanks and mosquito repellent like you wouldn't believe, because it's all swamp, right? This is a great opportunity now to look at some of the other areas that we can explore. So Russian influence, I think we can agree, really started post-World War II.
Yep.
And it spread throughout Europe, and it was spy versus spy versus spy for the longest period of time. Do you see similarities between what's going on right now and where we were at the pre-war part of World War II?
I do. And pre-war part of World War II, we saw international leaders going around with different diplomatic agendas in what's happening. And we had Chamberlain coming back into the UK saying peace in our time as he got off the aircraft. We're seeing similar going on at the moment. Both domestically, we've got Vladimir Putin has just visited Crimea on the 9th anniversary of the
2014
invasion. And then he went up allegedly into Mariupol, sending a message to the international community. This was a day or a couple of days after the International Criminal Court had just issued an arrest warrant for him.
Right.
Sticking a proverbial 2 fingers up at the international community, but also going to his domestic audience saying, "I'm not bothered by this. I'm doing this." And that was his first visit in, I think it was day 388 of his 10-day special military operation, that he went there or allegedly went there, because there's some discussion as to whether it was him or his body double. And then we had Xi Jinping coming to Moscow the day after that with a bit of diplomacy. Putin was hoping Xi Jinping would get off the fence and support him militarily much more overtly. Xi Jinping is playing a very careful diplomatic piece and hasn't got off the fence. He hasn't said he won't support him, but he hasn't said he will support him. And because Xi Jinping wants to buy Russian natural resources in the same way that he bought most of Africa. And feeding all of this in the background is the wider espionage game. From not just China, Russia, but also into the West. And I think in the West, we're beginning to wake up to what is going on, and probably what has been going on for many, many years.
Yeah, and it's interesting to sort of contrast the two. Now, a hysterical report in 2018 from the Harry Jackson think tank really painted a dim picture of where Russian influence had affected the United Kingdom, even suggesting that there were 70,000 agents here in the UK. What do you think? That seems high.
Yeah, I think this is a slight misuse of language and slight misuse of the word agent. An agent has got a very specific definition, a very specific role. An agent is someone that has been recruited by an intelligence officer because they have got access to information that intelligence officer wants to get to. They've got the motivation for somehow it's been generated to pass that information to the intelligence officer so that it can be brought in as part of the bigger picture. However, that agent will have lots of contacts, and the intelligence officer will have lots of contacts as well. So if we were to take the 70,000 or 75,000 number that the Henry Jackson Society came out with, and instead of using the word agent, described it as agents, contacts, both formal, informal, and everything else, and those could range from people who are just reposting something on social media without thinking about it. They don't know what's happening, or part of a deliberate organisation that is trying to push influence or to gather information to feed into a central point. then there could easily be 75,000 across the UK, because we took our eye off the ball when the wall came down and the Cold War finished, and we all went, Russia is now our friend. We can take all of our counterintelligence operations and we can turn them into counter-terror operations, because the terrorists are bad and nasty and we need to focus on that, and nobody's giving us any more money. And the Russians went, yes, you do all of that and focus on that, and of course we are not going to continue our intelligence operations. But hey, we lie.
Yeah, and speaking of lies, I think it culminated with the use of a chemical weapon on British soil. I think that might have been the wake-up call, because shortly after, in a 2019 UK parliamentary report, they now all of a sudden rediscovered that Russia was bad. It was their disinformation capabilities were formidable. The operations that they were conducting were brazen. I think it supports the idea that everybody was worried about Islamic counterterrorism, and nobody remembered the old protagonists that we had during the pre-war era, right?
Well, in the Cold War, it was as much an intelligence operation as it was a preparation for a military operation. There was at a national level, the different agencies were fighting and working with each other. At a military level, there was so much going on. I was based in Germany at the time, with the wall that was up, and there was an official Russian military mission into West Germany called SOXMIS. And in my organisation, we had a special surveillance unit that was there to surveil SOXMIS, covertly surveil SOXMIS and where they were going. But the reality was the Russians didn't trust SOXMIS to behave and not to defect. So they had Russian national intelligence officers from the KGB and elsewhere monitoring what the SOXMIS officers were doing. And they were even more deep undercover, and my surveillance teams were to go and monitor the Russian national intelligence capabilities, monitoring their SOXMIS and to follow them and look for opportunities to exploit. And it keeps on, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed at all. And this is where people have forgotten about it. The UK should have woken up whenever Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210. They didn't, because it was the height of the counter-terror piece and resources were tight. And they thought this is a one-off, and it wasn't a one-off, and that was proven by the Sergei Skripal attack in 2017. And it was only then that I think the British government realised, and I think global governments suddenly realised, that actually there's a very real threat. And we've had our eyes off the ball for so long that there's no point in going and closing the stable door after the horse is bolted, because not only is the horse bolted, but the horse has had several generations of foals that have worked through. The stables have fallen down and has been redeveloped into the latest supermarket site. So we have let all of this get completely ingrained, and we're trying to take that massive genie or multiple genies and get them back into the bottle when we don't even know where the bottle is.
Yeah, and I mean, compounding this was the influence that has happened now in UK society with the embracing of oligarchs and their money coming into both the British political elite as well as influencing, I think, sympathies, like you said, towards Russia and Russian ideals, which are sort of, I guess, in contrast to what British society really sees as its kind of value proposition. The other issue that I think is that the FBI came out with a report in February of 2023 proclaiming all the things that they've done, ranging from tracking down and seizing big boats, to assisting with cyber warfare, to dealing with interdiction of weapons and electronic equipment, and really putting the screws to anyone that was going to break sanctions. Unfortunately, it seems like the UK's approach is either too subtle and they're not interested in broadcasting it, or perhaps they're not doing enough.
Well, it's interesting. I think culturally, the US and the UK are different. We've got the mellowing post-McCarthyism in the United States, where everything was communist and there was the big fight on it, and that still is subsurfaced with a lot of the US intelligence agencies and all the rest of it, even though the politics has mellowed in many ways, and the acceptance of Russians and other non-US nationals and potential threats are in there. Whereas the UK has got a slightly different cultural approach. It's always been multicultural in the UK. It's a global financial hub, and therefore there's a lot of monies coming out of Russian oligarchs and coming in through London. It's an area of big investment because of the value of property and everything else, and therefore into business, and that's where you then get the influence into the political structures and everything else. And the British people tend to be overly trusting. Well, if they say they're not a spy, then clearly they're not a spy. So why should we accuse them of such? And everyone in British society sees the intelligence services and all the rest of it, unless they're watching James Bond, of course, but see it as something that's dirty and underhanded and definitely doesn't go on. Well, I'm sorry, folks, wake up and smell the coffee. It's the second oldest profession, and it's still going on today in the way it's always gone on. And a lot of the stuff that we see in Hollywood happens very differently. It tends to be very boring without the fast cars and everything else. But there's a lot more that comes in with the electronic side and the cyber side. But the UK also politically and geopolitically, we are now outside Europe. We're a bridge between Europe and the United States. And we're a link into the EU, so exploitable in there. We are a member of the Five Eyes community. I'm one of the founding members of the Five Eyes community, so there's interest within there. And we're also one of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. So from an espionage target perspective, whether it be to gather information to get back to influence what the Russians want to do, or whether it be to get in and start to influence things in a different way, that's what they want to do. And the UK is also not politically homogeneous, because we've got Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and England. And one of the big things that comes out of Russia in particular are influence operations to try and build on fractures that are there already. So they see political fractures between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom with what the SNP are doing, going for independence. So there'll be Russian money and effectively a knife in that crack, wiggling
leveraging,
it. The same in Northern Ireland when we've got the push for a United Ireland, and we've got the Assembly not sitting and everything else. There'll be huge Russian influences in through there, and that's exemplified by the fact that the largest Russian embassy of any country in Europe outside the UK is in Dublin.
Well, there you go.
And, and it's fascinating to see. But again, as a society, as people don't want to see that and therefore dismiss it. The reality is it's there, and people need to sit up and smell the coffee.
And so a couple of views here. You know what country in Europe and in NATO is not having any of it? It's Poland. So just a few days ago, Poland announced they disassembled a Russian intelligence operation that they've accused of preparing for and potentially conducting sabotage operations. Poland is arming up. It's also one of the main logistics bases for American support, as I mentioned earlier, that's coming into the Ukraine. I think Poland takes this threat really seriously.
Of course they do. Poland is right on the border with Ukraine and Belarus, and a target for Russian intelligence. They are on the front line, and being a huge staging post and logistic base for Western weapons moving into Ukraine. They are in the front line of the threat and everything else. But it's something that's increasingly recognised, and we're seeing penetration across the board. There's just been a senior intelligence officer from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German BND, arrested for spying for the Russians. And we've got influence in other countries across the EU. The EU is seen as something that is not politically homogeneous. It's got fractures all over it, and the Russian influence is in there trying to wiggle that. NATO is seen as a country that's got potential fractures in there.
Yeah, definitely.
Not as much as the EU, because NATO is more of a military alliance from a defensive perspective rather than. But it is a pseudo-political alliance at the same time, and has got real political influence. Hence why we've seen, I believe, Turkey changing its mind with regard to Finland. That'll be political pressure exerted through NATO channels to deal with that. But it's fascinating to see, and the Russians understand very carefully where all these friction points are.
Definitely.
And in good military terms, if you want to attack and have a successful attack, you attack along a boundary. And it's all the boundaries between these that we're seeing the Russians trying to influence.
Which leaves us at, it didn't cost Erdogan really anything to agree to Finland. For political reasons and the Turkish position on Kurds, he couldn't embrace Sweden and continues to be reluctant to sign off on that. But in a way, Turkey's opinion doesn't really matter because in the back pocket of Putin is Hungary.
Yeah.
And Hungary is a deep problem because, as you know, as a student of history, we know that Hungary was on the side of the Axis until the Russians occupied their territory. Then they switched sides, and they were dealt with very harshly by the Russians. So we're in this situation where we have a member of NATO who has veto power about who can join and who can't join. I see this as we took our eye off the ball of Hungary as sort of, I'm going to say, the intelligence services. I think we're right back in it now, and that Budapest is going to become the center of a lot of political activity and a lot of, shall we say, intelligence operations to move the needle more favorable to NATO and less favorable to Russia. What are your thoughts? Are we back to the spy versus spy game?
Oh, 100% we're in there. 100% we're in there. And it's interesting, the Hungarian leadership are very firm in their pseudo support for Putin. However, if you look at the decisions that they've been making in support of NATO and support of the EU, they've got a right of veto against EU support into Ukraine. They have used that on a couple of occasions and then caved in. Right. So they've allowed the EU to supply things in, and that's where the political pressure is coming in. And often a lot of this political pressure comes in and is delivered through national spy agencies. So even into Moscow at the moment, the CIA links into Russian intelligence services and MI6 links into Russian intelligence services and your BND links into them will all be very strong. And that's where the diplomatic messages are being sent in as much as diplomatic messages coming out and being brought together. So that formal liaison bit is as much a role for the spy agencies as recruiting agents and running spies. And Hungary is... It's interesting to try and work out what their motivation is. I think we're just seeing motivation from individuals within the Hungarian government rather than it being a countrywide policy. But it's I think it's indicative of a wider malaise that there is across the EU, that if we don't keep an eye on it very carefully, it could spread. And that wider malaise is if I saw a survey recently where a large percentage, still a minority percentage, but a large percentage of Germans believed everything that was coming out from Putin, and that the war was justified from a Russian perspective because NATO was expanding and everything else. We're getting our understanding of the messaging wrong if that's there. But again, if we go wider and we look at the United States, look at the political differences that there are between the Democratic line that's coming out at the moment and the Republican line that is coming out of some of the more hardline Republican senators. And Putin is sitting there watching it going, aha, fantastic, right, so all we have to do is wait until the next presidential election. If it's a Republican president comes in, then all of this support for Ukraine will change dramatically. And those billions of dollars that the US taxpayer has given in supporting Ukraine could go to waste.
Well, it's interesting because I think that's a great opportunity to talk about another major geopolitical factor that's going on right now is the banking crisis.
Yes.
And the fact that if folks are focused, if the leadership of Europe is focused on domestic issues like France, the arbitrary and undemocratic raising of the retirement age, and as usual, the French protest by burning everything they can lay their hands on. You've got the UK, very divisive issue over small boats, asylum seekers, etc. We have a number of domestic issues that I think are being fanned by Russian intelligence operations and domestic politics to take the focus off the unity of helping out the Ukraine. Not to mention the fact it's hard to justify sending billions of dollars over to the Ukraine in aid of their struggle if domestically, the banks are falling apart because of an international financial contagion. So I think in a lot of ways, Putin is masterminding a bit of focus work, going back to the doctrine of misinformation that Russia has used successfully in a number of other cases. I think we're going to see an increase in domestic unrest in a short period of time. How do you think that might take the wind out of the sails in terms of like the unequivocal support for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think what Putin wants is to elongate the conflict as much as possible, knowing he sees everything that's going on in the international community. He sees, and a lot of this is down to the economic impact of the energy crisis that came on the back of Putin, the loss of access to Russian gas and Russian oil. He sees wider instability, especially with the refugee crisis and all the rest of it, in the control of grain and oil and the impact that's having out of what was the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the world. And he's seeing that only getting worse as things go on over a longer period of time, as well as the political instability that automatically comes with US presidential elections, UK general elections, and then we're getting into wider European elections and everything else. And the more unrest, the more little moving parts that he can find these friction points and put a proverbial knife in and wiggle them just to make them even worse, the more he knows that it will take Western eyes off what's going on in Ukraine and will eventually lead to an increasing amount of Ukraine fatigue. And therefore, the longer this goes on, the better it bodes for Putin to get some form of outcome that he can accept. And this is where, if the international community can solidify behind Ukraine and allow Ukraine to get a short, sharp, relatively fast, and when I mean short, sharp, relatively fast, within the next 2 years, push of Russia out of Ukraine, then that's the only way it's going to get properly fractured and push Russia away. If we don't do that, and Putin does get this elongated conflict, and we do get further political unrest and everything else, he will sit there happy, and he'll just come back and take another salami slice from someone else in a few years' time. And of course, we've got Xi Jinping sitting there, watching. And if he thinks that that's what's going to happen, he's ready to take his salami slices out of different parts of the world. He's already got ideas into Afghanistan. We know what he's looking at in Taiwan and elsewhere, and that's why the Southeast Asian pivot seems to be happening in a lot of the security side of things. And whilst Russia is our immediate threat, and this has come out of the review of the integrated review in the UK, looking at wider security threats and what we're going to do about it. Russia is the immediate threat. The longer term threat remains China and what's happening in Southeast Asia and the impact that that's going to have globally.
We've seen new technologies deployed in the Ukraine, essentially civilianized technologies, especially when it comes to the use of cell phones and smartphones and apps. There is a big kerfuffle. Maybe it's even more than a kerfuffle over TikTok.
Yes.
Let's think about that in the context of, is it really a Chinese intelligence operation thinly disguised as one of the world's most popular social media apps ever?
Well, if I wanted to develop something that was primarily there to harvest as much data as possible, gain access to everything that's on a facility where that app is on it and all the rest of it, take that back and put it into big data databases that I can then compare against everything else, harvest everything that's going on in any other app that exists on that facility and everything else, then what I'd want to do is generate something that would go viral and be very popular and people would want to use and put on their phones and everything else. So whether it's TikTok or a game like Pokemon Go or something else that's out there that goes viral, you want to develop something that people want to download and want to use. And they think, hey, this is brilliant, I have to have this. And when you put the terms and conditions out, they go, hey, I don't care, I accept.
Share with all my friends.
And the difference between, every social media app is harvesting data. Right. If anything that's free, nothing's free, it means you are the commodity.
Right.
However, there's a difference between what that data is being used for. And if that data is being used for commercial purposes, which most of the apps are doing and all the rest of it, and to refine your experience and everything else, where it is part of an organization that has got some form of legal oversight, so a US entity, a European entity, a UK entity, whatever, that you've got the legal oversight from European GDPR, from UK GDPR, from some of the American
data protection laws.
Privacy and data protection laws that are there. Whereas if you get into the likes of China, where data protection does not exist and there's no control over what data is collected, what it's being used for, and everything else, and there's no ability to do it. In the West, if the press finds out something that goes wrong, and this is why I mentioned Pokemon Go. When Pokemon Go first came out, there was a big furore because it got access to everything, including most of the stuff it didn't need on your phone.
Right.
And that big furore was brought out in the press, and then the company behind it turned around and went, we don't want this to continue because it's going to affect us commercially. I didn't know what the commercial angle was because there wasn't one. It's going to affect us commercially, and therefore they closed down all of that and put big press statements out. But there was a mechanism to hold them to account. There isn't with the apps that come out of China. There isn't with TikTok. And TikTok, I would argue, is first and foremost an intelligence gathering tool. The front end of it is viral because that means everyone wants to get out and use it. And boy, is it gathering an awful lot of intelligence. And it's going into the big data databases that the Chinese government are using to analyze everything. And they're firing stuff back to us to try and influence the way we think. They're using stuff that they can exploit through their APTs on a wider cyber bit. They're firing other information up to some of their partners, like into Russia, so Russia can target its APTs in a way to attack us in different ways, because they're acting as this massive sink of everything. And their understanding of how individuals are operating across the globe and what they're doing and what they're thinking and what they like and what they is second to none, and people need to recognize that.
Forbes broke an article about the tracking of journalists, and this is part of the narrative in the United States that feels that ByteDance needs to divest TalkTalk of its Chinese ownership in order to secure the use of this particular app. And now it's been banned on UK government. How it got there in the first place is something where we could...
Well, exactly.
Yeah, but now it's been banned on UK government phones, as well as in the United States, or a ban is imminent on it. Yeah. This seems to be China's end-around game where, Huawei, Zytel, a bunch of different Chinese manufacturers get popular either to do the price versus features versus your data is of interest to us at a nation state protagonist level. Are we going to see sort of more Chinese end-arounds in terms of like their relationship to the American tech market specifically?
Well, 100%. It's not just the American tech market, it's the global tech market. And I think it's already there. I think we're becoming increasingly aware of it. Article 7 of the Chinese National Intelligence Law requires companies in China to cooperate with Chinese intelligence if they're asked. ByteDance, who own TikTok, whenever they were approached for comment by the BBC recently about TikTok being used as an intelligence gathering tool and this Chinese law, ByteDance turned around and said, "Oh no, we will never apply that law. We'll never cooperate with Chinese intelligence." Well, that means they're breaking the Chinese law. That doesn't go down well in China if you break the law. But the other thing is, what they forgot was in 2020, they admitted to following two US journalists that were going to talk to people inside TikTok, and they said a number of others, and they'd accessed all of their data. So on one hand they're saying, we can't access this data, we don't access this data, we don't give it to the Chinese state. On the other hand, they've just admitted to having done it. Yep. And when you look at their board, ByteDance is a large portion of the shareholding is by Chinese state-owned companies. And on the board there are Chinese Communist Party committees, and one of the vice presidents leads the committees. So it is inexorably linked in, and of course they're probably going to say, publicly going to say, no, we don't do this, because most people out there naively will go, oh well, they've said they don't do it, so they mustn't do it. The reality is completely different.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, let's thank both Security Magazine and our hosts here at the Friend at Hand Pub in Bloomsbury. I'm Ian Thornton-Trump, and Philip Ingram and I co-host this on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and the Friend at Hand is great, and Security Magazine, well worth a read.
Yeah, definitely.